What if I told you a royal prince just walked out of Buckingham Palace after uncovering what could be the monarchy's biggest financial scandal in decades? Prince Edward, long seen as the most loyal and reserved member of the royal family, has just resigned from all royal duties. Why? Because he allegedly found secret off-book transactions, hidden estate profits, and layers of financial deception buried deep inside the crown's accounts. And when he asked for answers, he was shut down. In this investigation, we uncover the leaked report, what Edward found, and why his quiet departure may be the most dangerous challenge the royal family has ever faced. Stay with us, because this story rewrites everything you thought you knew about royal integrity. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. It began with a walk, not a royal procession, not a balcony appearance, not even a planned public engagement. Just a walk. Down a quiet hallway in Buckingham Palace, early in the morning before most of the staff had arrived. Prince Edward, youngest son of the late Queen Elizabeth II, moved with a purpose, his face unreadable, his mind racing. In his hand was a folder. Inside, according to leaked reports now sending tremors through the monarchy, were papers that would set fire to the quiet assumptions about royal finances and challenge one of the most powerful institutions in the world. The palace had always been a fortress of tradition, of secrecy, of unchallenged control. But on that morning, something cracked. Not in the walls, not in the protocol, in the silence. Prince Edward didn't give a press conference. He didn't schedule a formal resignation. He didn't even alert his private secretary. He simply walked into his office, left a handwritten note on his desk, and stepped out. Out of the building, out of the firm, out of the life he had lived since the moment he was born. What happened next remains, in many ways, a mystery. But the ripple effects of that walk have been anything but quiet. Less than 24 hours after Edward's departure, anonymous sources close to the crown leaked damning information to a British investigative news outlet. The report included references to financial mismanagement, off-book accounts, and unexplained income streams flowing from royal estates through private intermediaries. The leak alleged that Edward had been investigating these accounts for months, silently, discreetly, and against mounting resistance from within the institution. When he requested an independent audit and was denied, something in him broke. He didn't fight. He walked. The monarchy has weathered scandal before. Divorce, infidelity, abdications, exile. But what makes this moment different is its implications. If the allegations are true, we are no longer talking about personal failings or private disputes. We're talking about institutional secrecy. About millions in public funds tied to a crown that receives taxpayer support. About a system designed to avoid transparency and a prince who dared to shine light where the shadows were never meant to be disturbed. Why did Edward speak now? Why walk away after decades of service and relative silence? And more importantly, what did he find? This story is not one of rebellion, but reckoning. Prince Edward, long considered the quiet royal, the dutiful younger brother, the dependable courtier, the safe pair of hands, has never made headlines like his siblings. He has never aired family grievances on global television. He has not been the subject of tabloid obsession or celebrity speculation. In fact, for much of his adult life, he has operated almost invisibly, attending charity events, performing ceremonial duties, and standing just behind the spotlight. That's what made this moment all the more shocking. Because for Edward to leave, to remove himself from the heart of royal life, to say goodbye to Buckingham Palace, not in disgrace, but in protest, speaks volumes about what he must have seen. And what he saw, according to insiders, was not just waste or mismanagement. It was something darker, something carefully hidden. A system of financial channels that moved money in ways no one was supposed to trace. The leaked report points to discrepancies in the management of royal estates, properties that technically belong to the crown but are administered in the interest of the nation. Funds from the Duchy of Lancaster and Duchy of Cornwall, traditionally used to support royal activities, were allegedly redirected through third-party firms. Some of these firms were registered offshore. Others had no clear accountability mechanisms. On paper, the numbers balanced. But dig beneath the surface, and things began to unravel. And Prince Edward, with his background in estate management and his often overlooked position on the boards of several royal trusts, was one of the few with access to both the high-level accounts and the operational details. He saw the gaps, the inconsistencies, the shifting numbers that didn't match the annual reports. And rather than remain quiet, as so many royals before him had done, he asked questions. At first, They were informal. A conversation here, a request there. But over time, as his inquiries deepened, he met resistance. Emails went unanswered. Meetings were postponed. Documents were under review. And when he finally requested an independent, external audit of several Crown Estate revenue streams, the answer came quickly and without ambiguity: no. What followed, according to palace staff who have since broken their silence under condition of anonymity, was a cold freeze. Edward was no longer included in finance briefings. His appearances were scaled back. He was publicly praised for his quiet service while privately being sidelined. He had touched something sacred, not to the nation, but to the institution. And that is when he made his decision. He would not go to the press. He would not threaten. He would not bargain. He would simply walk away. And so he did. His departure wasn't followed by a royal statement. There was no flag lowered. No press secretary fielding questions. Just a line in a news ticker that read, "Prince Edward to step back from public duties for an unspecified period." It was the kind of phrasing the palace uses when it wants to bury a story before it begins. But this story refused to be buried. Within 48 hours of his departure, the leak reached the media. And from that point forward, the monarchy was no longer controlling the narrative. It was reacting to it. Public response was immediate and intense. Social media exploded with speculation. Major networks launched special reports. The phrase "Edward walked" trended for 72 hours straight. Commentators and analysts, some sympathetic, some skeptical, began dissecting what this meant for the royal brand, for public trust, and for the future of the institution itself. Inside the palace, damage control began. Advisors scrambled to discredit the documents. Legal teams reviewed the original letter's patent governing Edward's role and title. Charles remained silent. William, seen briefly attending an event days later, avoided questions. Camilla, often the public stabilizer in moments of unrest, canceled a scheduled appearance. The institution, designed to endure, was wobbling. And at the center of it all was Edward, the brother who never sought the throne, now holding the crown to account in a way no one else had dared. This video will take you through every layer of this unfolding crisis. You'll learn who leaked the report, what it revealed, why Edward's findings were so explosive, and how his decision could change the conversation about royal finances forever. We'll unpack the background of these financial structures, explore the hidden power struggles within the firm, and ask a deeper question. What does accountability look like when the institution you're questioning is one of the most powerful in the world? Because in this story, there are no clear villains, no easy resolutions, just a man raised to serve, choosing to speak, not through an interview, not through outrage, but by leaving everything behind, including his seat at the table. For most of his life, Prince Edward has been the royal family's quiet anchor, a man often overlooked by the public, rarely pursued by tabloids, and almost never the subject of palace intrigue. In an institution shaped by spectacle and scandal, Edward's greatest distinction was his restraint. While his siblings, Charles, Anne and Andrew, were swept up in divorces, controversies, and headlines, Edward maintained a reputation for discretion and consistency. He was loyal, predictable, uncontroversial, but that very image of the silent, steady prince may be what allowed him to see what others didn't and to act when others wouldn't. Born on March 10, 1964, at Buckingham Palace, Edward was the youngest of Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip's 4 children. From the beginning, his place in the line of succession, 7th at birth, meant he was unlikely to ever reign. Unlike Charles, who was groomed for kingship, and whose sharp instincts earned her the Queen's respect, Edward's role was never clearly defined. He would not carry the weight of the crown, nor the fire of rebellion. Instead, he would be expected to serve dutifully and without drawing attention. His early life followed the royal blueprint: private schooling at Gordonstown, a stint in the Royal Marines, which he left early, causing a minor scandal, and then a quiet pivot to the arts. Edward's brief venture into television production was met with skepticism by the British press. At the time, royals engaging in commercial ventures were viewed with suspicion. His production company, Ardent, struggled to find footing and eventually shuttered. But the attempt was telling. It revealed a young man who wanted to work, not just wave. He wasn't content to simply be royal. He wanted purpose. In time, that desire found expression in royal duty. After stepping away from media work, Edward focused on public service. He took over as president and patron of numerous charities, many of them focused on education, the arts, and youth development. His work with the Duke of Edinburgh's award, founded by his father, was particularly significant. Edward not only promoted the program globally, but helped modernize its operations. In doing so, he earned the quiet admiration of those within the palace structure. He wasn't flashy, but he was effective. Within royal circles, Edward became known as the safe royal. He never upstaged anyone. He never leaked to the press. He never took sides in internal conflicts. In a family that often ran on ego and legacy, Edward managed to build goodwill simply by staying out of the way. But that invisibility, it turns out, gave him something rare in the royal institution: access without suspicion. Unlike Charles, who had to guard every word, or William, whose every move was a headline, Edward was free to move through the palace unencumbered. He was present at high-level meetings, often serving in ceremonial or logistical roles. He had regular contact with palace staff, accountants, trustees. He wasn't the focus, but he was always in the room. Over the years, this positioning placed him at the intersection of tradition and operation. While Charles focused on legacy and William on modernization, Edward became the quiet administrator. The one who ensured things happened, who understood how the palace machinery actually worked. He was present at estate planning sessions, trust board reviews, and royal patronage audits. His signature appeared on documents no one else cared to read, and he asked questions that others were too distracted to consider. It was during these years, particularly the decade leading up to Queen Elizabeth's death, that Edward's role began to evolve. As the Queen aged and Charles assumed more active leadership, Edward took on increased responsibility within the logistical operations of royal properties. His oversight of certain elements of the Crown Estate and the Duchy of Lancaster, while unofficial, became more involved. He served as a bridge between public-facing roles and internal management. And, in time, he began to notice patterns. It started small. A line item on a property lease renewal that seemed unusually high. A payment to a contractor whose services couldn't be verified. A donation from an international source that bypassed the usual disclosure protocols. Edward didn't panic. He didn't raise alarm. But he took notes. Quietly. Methodically. Some of those closest to him later described this phase as the accountant's awakening. Edward, a man not trained in finance, began educating himself on the palace's financial structure. He met with advisors, requested briefings, and read reports many other royals ignored. The more he learned, the more questions emerged. Why were certain estate revenues routed through independent management firms? Why were offshore trusts mentioned in passing during otherwise standard audits? Why were older records missing digital backups? Edward didn't jump to conclusions. He assumed there were explanations, but those explanations never quite came. And so he kept digging. All of this occurred in silence. Publicly, Edward continued to represent the family with grace. He appeared at ceremonial events, open community centers, gave speeches. Behind the scenes, he was building a mental map of the monarchy's financial framework, one with surprising gaps. His position gave him access, but not control. Still, it was enough to start assembling a picture that troubled him deeply. What began as curiosity evolved into suspicion. And suspicion, over time, became concern. But Edward was a man of the institution. He didn't leak. He didn't rebel. He followed protocol. He raised his concerns through internal channels. And that's when the resistance began. Emails that once received quick replies began to go unanswered. Meetings were rescheduled. Conversations became curt. It was subtle, but unmistakable. Edward, the safe royal, had asked the wrong question. He had noticed something he wasn't supposed to. And from that moment on, he was treated differently. Still, he persisted. Not because he wanted to make headlines. Not because he had political ambitions. But because something didn't add up. And for a man raised in the heart of the monarchy, that mattered. He began to document his findings, not publicly, but privately. He made copies, filed notes, recorded dates and conversations. Some staffers, seeing the tension, began quietly cooperating. A few even provided documents of their own, internal memos, invoices, audit summaries. What Edward compiled over the next year, according to insiders, was a portfolio of evidence. Not proof of criminality, but proof of concealment. And that, for Edward, was enough. He requested a meeting with senior royal financial officers. He asked for an independent audit, not just of the Duchy of Lancaster, but of the Crown Estate's supplemental income streams. The meeting was brief. His request was denied. Not discouraged, Edward escalated. He brought his concerns to a private meeting with his brother, now King Charles III. He explained what he had found, what he believed, what he feared. The conversation, according to those familiar, was civil but cold. Charles, always measured, reportedly thanked Edward for his concern but dismissed the issue as administrative noise. The monarchy, he insisted, had far more important responsibilities. Edward left that meeting with the realization that no one was going to act. And that's when something changed. For decades, Edward had served silently, faithfully. He had accepted his secondary role without bitterness. But this time, his conscience outweighed his comfort. He made his decision not out of anger, but out of clarity. He would walk away, not to destroy the institution, but to protect the values he thought it represented. The man once dismissed as the quiet royal had become the one voice the monarchy feared most, because he knew where the silence had settled, and he was no longer willing to be a part of it. There is a certain mythology that surrounds the British monarchy, an assumption of permanence, of order, of meticulous control. From the gilded halls of Buckingham Palace to the velvet-lined thrones of ceremonial halls, the crown has long been viewed not just as a symbol of national identity, but as a structure of moral and financial integrity. But like any ancient institution, that image depends on layers of ritual, secrecy, and tightly managed perception. It was within this hushed and orderly world that Prince Edward began to notice the first cracks. It didn't start with a revelation. It started with numbers. Edward had always taken a genuine interest in the behind-the-scenes operations of the monarchy. While others focused on speeches, ceremonies, and diplomacy, he quietly carved out a role monitoring the smaller, but no less important mechanics of royal life: patronage events, property renovations, travel logistics, and especially estate affairs. It wasn't glamorous, but it mattered. And over time, it gave him an unfiltered look at how money moved within the royal system. One of Edward's earliest concerns surfaced during a seemingly routine review of property maintenance budgets for one of the lesser-known crown estates in northern England. A scheduled renovation, originally approved for a £400,000 allocation, had ballooned to nearly £1.2 million. When Edward asked for an updated breakdown of costs, he received a 2-page summary with vague descriptions, consulting fees, expedited logistics, unforeseen infrastructure upgrades. None of it sat right. He inquired further and was met with polite but pointed resistance. A staffer from the estate office explained that some records were not digitized. Another claimed the detailed invoices had been consolidated by the external firm managing the project. When Edward asked who had authorized that level of third-party discretion, the conversation was abruptly redirected. It was the first time Edward sensed something wasn't quite right. Not criminal, not explosive, but concealed. In the months that followed, he began casually cross-referencing other estate expenditures, especially those involving external contractors and property leases. And as he did, a troubling pattern emerged: inflated payments, repeated vendor names across unrelated projects, identical invoice formats with differing issuing addresses. At first glance, they were anomalies, but stacked together, they pointed to systemic inconsistency. The Duchy of Lancaster, one of the two major sources of royal private income, became a focal point of his attention. The duchy's properties, farms, and commercial holdings generate millions in revenue each year, much of it directed toward the sovereign grant and private royal expenses. But unlike public government departments, the duchy operates with a high level of privacy. Its audits are internal, its oversight limited, and its reporting, while legally sound, is strategically vague. Edward began requesting more frequent updates from the duchy's administrators. On paper, everything appeared above board. Yet, the language of the financial reports was carefully sanitized. Income streams were described in aggregate. Expenditures were broad categories: no line-item accountability, no vendor-level transparency. One report, issued in late spring, raised a red flag. It referenced international licensing partnerships as a new source of income under real estate development. Edward, confused by the phrasing, asked for clarification. The response he received was delayed and deflective, noting only that strategic partnerships are confidential and executed in accordance with Crown financial policy. That phrase stuck with him: confidential partnerships. What kind of partnerships? With whom? And why were they being categorized under real estate? Over time, Edward realized that he was hitting a wall, not of incompetence, but of intent. He wasn't just dealing with accounting delays. He was encountering deliberate opacity. More troubling were the donations. Several of the charities under the royal family's patronage umbrella reported receiving anonymous contributions routed through shell organizations based in Gibraltar and Jersey, British offshore territories with notorious financial secrecy laws. While such donations weren't necessarily illegal, they raised questions. Who was giving this money? Why were they using intermediaries? And what obligations, if any, did they create? Edward brought these concerns to his senior advisor within the palace's financial office, someone he trusted. The response was firm. It's above your clearance. It was the first time the phrase had been used with him. He hadn't realized there were layers of clearance within a system he'd spent his life serving. That moment marked a shift in Edward's approach. If direct inquiry wasn't yielding results, he would begin gathering the information himself. He reached out quietly, cautiously, to trusted contacts in the charity sector, real estate advisors who had worked with the duchy, even former staffers who had managed logistical accounts. He wasn't asking them to break the law or share confidential documents. He was asking questions. Simple ones. Have you noticed inconsistencies in the way the palace allocates funds? Were you ever asked to sign non-disclosure agreements before reviewing estate budgets? Have you seen contractors get paid without explanation? The answers came in fragments, but they all pointed in the same direction. Something wasn't right. Not just isolated incidents, but a culture of selective transparency. A system designed not to steal, but to obscure. Edward started keeping records. He compiled a private ledger with notes, summaries, and timelines. He compared internal reports with public filings. He flagged repeated vendor names and recurring payment codes. He discovered that one firm, Crown Solutions Limited, had received over £8 million in contracts across 7 years, yet had no discernible office, website, or public-facing documentation. Its address linked back to a legal office in Luxembourg. It was enough to alarm him, but not yet enough to act. He returned once more to the palace financial office, this time with a request for a formal audit of Crown Solutions Limited. He didn't accuse. He didn't threaten. He simply asked for due diligence. The response was colder this time. Prince Edward, the email read, "This matter falls outside your operational purview. We appreciate your engagement but must ask you to defer to senior oversight." Translated, it meant, stop asking. But Edward wouldn't stop. He wasn't driven by scandal, ego, or revenge. He was driven by the realization that something fundamentally misaligned with the monarchy's public image was happening behind the scenes. And if it was allowed to continue, if secrecy prevailed, then the institution he had served for decades would become not a pillar of integrity, but a fortress of privilege hiding its own erosion. One evening, alone in his study, Edward reviewed everything he had collected. Financial reports, memos, charitable summaries, vendor contracts, notes from quiet conversations. And he began to understand something crucial. It wasn't about one transaction. It wasn't about one property. It wasn't even about one firm. It was about the system. A system built not to defraud, but to protect itself, to preserve the illusion of control. A system that prioritized narrative over numbers, ritual over reality. And it was in that moment, looking down at the neatly ordered pages on his desk, that Edward realized he had crossed a threshold. He could no longer pretend that what he was seeing was acceptable. He could no longer play the role of the silent prince. He didn't yet know what he would do, but he knew he would do something. The final breach didn't begin with a scandalous confrontation. It began with a brown envelope. It was anonymous, no name, no return address, no official seal. Just a plain envelope slipped under Prince Edward's office door one crisp morning in early autumn. Inside was a folder, thick with printed documents, stapled and organized with the precision of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. There was no cover note, no letter of explanation. Just 2 words scribbled on the top page in capital letters. Look closely. At first, Edward assumed it was a joke. The palace receives all manner of odd correspondence. He skimmed the first few pages with detached curiosity, but his interest sharpened with every line he read. These were not random papers. They were internal records, ledgers, bank transfers, audit memos, meeting minutes. And they weren't just about royal operations. They were about royal secrets. Over the following hours, Edward pored over the contents in silence, eyes narrowing, hands still. The documents pointed to a highly structured system of financial movement, one that appeared designed not only to avoid scrutiny, but to permanently detach large sums from their original sources. Off-book accounts, multi-layered holding firms, shell corporations operating out of tax havens in the Caribbean and the Channel Islands. Some of the entities he recognized, others were completely new to him. Crown-linked firms with seemingly no staff. Estate revenue diversions categorized under obscure legal terms. Repetitive contractual payouts to subsidiaries that led to the same 5 offshore holding companies. The numbers were staggering. Over a span of 8 years, nearly £34 million had been routed through these networks without being formally accounted for in any publicly released royal financial report. And this wasn't a case of missing funds. This was intentional rerouting, masked as third-party operational fees, historical estate adjustments, and infrastructure reserves. One document, a transfer record dated from 3 years prior, showed a 7-figure payment from a Crown estate asset directly to a foreign bank account registered under a trust bearing no recognizable royal link. But cross-referencing the dates and transactions, Edward realized this trust had been used multiple times by multiple royal estate officers, each time under slightly different names, each time protected by layered corporate veils. The deeper he went, the clearer the picture became. This was not the work of a rogue employee or a one-off misjudgment. This was a structure, an ecosystem, and it raised 1,000 questions. Who designed it? Who authorized it? Who else knew? And perhaps most pressing, what was the monarchy using these shadow accounts for? That evening, Edward didn't go home. He stayed in his office, alone. He reviewed every page again. He took notes, cross-checked bank codes, listed out the recurring firms. He built a timeline stretching across the past decade. He highlighted transactions that coincided with large-scale property developments. He underlined connections between charities, trusts, and private contractors. He didn't sleep. By morning, he had assembled something more than suspicion. He had evidence. But how had this dossier ended up in his hands? Who had the access and the courage to assemble something so comprehensive, so dangerous? And why give it to him? The envelope had no fingerprints. The pages were crisp but unmarked by annotation. Whoever delivered it wanted no credit, only action. Edward's instincts told him this wasn't just about money. It was about integrity, about the line between privacy and deception. He remembered what his mother, Queen Elizabeth II, once told him. The crown must not only act with honor, it must be seen to do so. That principle, so often repeated in speeches, now seemed at risk of collapse. But Edward also knew the risk of confronting the system head-on. The monarchy was not a corporation. It didn't answer to shareholders. It didn't conduct business in the open. It operated behind tradition, ceremony, and loyalty. Challenging its inner financial workings meant not just confronting the accountants, but the culture. He weighed his options. Public exposure would trigger an institutional war. Quiet escalation could be intercepted or shut down. But doing nothing would make him complicit. He chose a path in between. He called a meeting with a small, trusted circle, advisors he had worked with for years. Lawyers with experience in sovereign finance. A former auditor who once reviewed Crown charity expenditures. A discreet forensic accountant. Over the next week, Edward walked them through what he had discovered, laying out the ledgers, the connections, the questions. They reviewed the files independently. One by one, they confirmed what he feared. The system was real. The patterns intentional. The risk enormous. If this goes public, one of them warned, the palace will be in crisis. I know, Edward replied. That's why I'm not taking it public, yet. Instead, Edward made one last attempt at resolution within the institution. He compiled a sanitized, redacted version of the dossier. He removed identifiers, omitted names, and presented it as a summary of financial irregularities in need of third-party review. He requested a private audience with King Charles. The meeting was brief, less than 40 minutes. Edward presented his findings with calm clarity. He didn't accuse. He didn't demand. He simply laid out what he had found and requested an external audit, an independent examination of estate-related financial operations over the last decade. The king listened, asked a few questions, then offered a tight response. These matters are handled through the proper internal channels. Edward pressed. The internal channels are part of the problem. Charles, according to those briefed afterward, ended the conversation there. No commitment, no denial. just a warning masked as protocol. We must always think of the crown before we think of ourselves. It was a line that echoed in Edward's mind long after the meeting ended. Days passed. No follow-up. No inquiries. Then, quietly, Edward was removed from the internal finance briefings he had long attended. His access to sensitive documentation was curtailed. His requests began to be routed through secondary assistants rather than direct staff. The message was unmistakable. Step back. Instead, Edward stepped out. With the original dossier still locked in his private study, he began preparing to leave Buckingham Palace altogether. It wasn't a grand decision, it was a solemn one. He didn't pack ceremonially. He didn't issue a statement. He informed only his closest staff and left the rest to unfold as it would. But before he walked out, he took one more step. He made a digital copy of the full dossier, redacted in parts, but still explosive, and encrypted it. He gave that copy to a journalist he trusted, anonymously, through a secure channel. He didn't include his name. He didn't include a threat. Just a cover note with a single sentence. The truth matters more than the title. If silence was the palace's preferred weapon, then Prince Edward had just shattered it. Days after receiving and dissecting the dossier of shadow financial dealings, Edward crossed a point of no return. He was no longer the quiet observer. No longer the silent brother who played his role and kept his head down. He was now something far more dangerous to the royal establishment, a man with questions, evidence, and a conscience that refused to be silenced. The official confrontation began not in front of cameras, not through lawyers or parliament, but in the sterile intimacy of a small boardroom on the second floor of St. James's Palace. The room was plain, wood-paneled, with a single long table and a bank of windows that looked out over the courtyard. It had hosted hundreds of quiet meetings over the years, most forgotten, some historic. This one would belong to the latter. Edward had summoned 3 individuals, the chief royal treasurer, a private estate financial advisor, and the senior crown estate liaison. He didn't announce the topic ahead of time. He didn't want the meeting canceled. As they entered, each man exchanged glances, unsure of what exactly they were walking into. Edward greeted them with a calm formality, thanked them for their time, and then opened a leather folder on the table. Inside were printouts from the leaked ledger. Redacted, but unmistakably incriminating. He spoke without raising his voice. This, he said, is a summary of transactions connected to crown-linked entities that I believe require urgent review. The room fell quiet. The senior treasurer leaned forward, scanning the top page. His brow creased. Where did you get these? Edward didn't answer directly. What matters is that they exist, and that they've gone unaccounted for in our formal reports. The financial advisor, normally reserved, spoke up. Your Royal Highness, these records, if accurate, imply external partnerships far outside our jurisdiction. That's precisely the problem, Edward replied. If they're outside our jurisdiction, but still tied to our name, then we're operating in the dark. And if they're within our jurisdiction, then we failed to disclose them. Either way, we have a problem. The room tensed. The men began glancing at one another, trying to calibrate their responses. The Crown Estate liaison finally broke the silence with what Edward later described as calculated ambiguity. He said the documents, if legitimate, may represent long-standing arrangements made by previous financial committees, and that such relationships were often established for flexibility in estate management. Edward leaned forward. Flexibility is not immunity. He placed another document on the table. A payment trail from a royal estate transaction that, according to his findings, ended in a private trust registered in a jurisdiction flagged for secrecy and tax sheltering. Explain this, he said. Why does a donation to a royal patronage appear to have passed through 3 offshore firms before reaching the UK? There was no immediate answer. The senior treasurer, clearly rattled, offered a weak response. That may have been a logistical routing decision to accommodate international regulations. Or, Edward countered, a way to avoid scrutiny. The temperature in the room dropped. The confrontation had shifted from financial oversight to ethical accountability. Edward didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply asked the question that changed everything. When did the monarchy decide that secrecy was preferable to honesty? The response was silence. Prolonged. Thick. It was the kind of moment where everyone in the room understands the gravity of what's just been said. But no one wants to be the first to acknowledge it. Eventually, the liaison spoke. With respect, sir, this is not a matter for public debate. These are internal mechanisms, well within the discretion of the institution. Edward's expression tightened. The institution is publicly funded. It's publicly trusted. And if we can't explain how our money moves, we have no right to spend it. He made one final request, a formal audit. Not internal, not reviewed by royal staff, but conducted by a third-party firm with full access to the estate's financial infrastructure over the past 10 years. The reaction was immediate and defensive. There's no precedent for that, the treasurer said. Edward replied simply, there's no precedent for this, motioning again to the documents. They declined his request on the spot. No need for consideration. The tone had already been set. This was not a negotiation. This was a warning. The meeting ended abruptly. No commitments were made. As the advisors filed out of the room, Edward remained seated, alone. His proposal had been shut down, his concern dismissed. But in his mind, the true confrontation was only beginning. Hours later, he sent a formal written request to the king's private office, summarizing the meeting and renewing his call for an independent financial review. He included a sample of the documents, framed as evidence, and warned that failure to act would be interpreted as complicity, if not culpability. 3 days passed. No response. On the 4th day, Edward received a message, not from the king himself, but from his principal private secretary. The statement was brief, measured, and immovable. The Crown is aware of the matters raised. All operations are being conducted within the established guidelines and protocols. At this time, no further action is deemed necessary. Edward read the letter twice, then folded it. He understood what it meant. The palace had made its choice. Not to investigate. Not to clarify. To contain. He was not surprised, but he was changed. That afternoon, Edward returned to his private quarters. He instructed his senior aide to cancel all public engagements for the foreseeable future. He informed his private security detail that they would no longer be required after the end of the month. He began boxing up personal items from his office. Framed photos, books, gifts. He didn't make a show of it. He didn't inform the press. He simply prepared. And in the space of days, the youngest son of Queen Elizabeth II decided to walk away from the palace that had been his home, his workplace, and his inheritance. Not in disgrace, not in scandal, in protest. To those who knew him best, it wasn't a surprise. Edward had never been interested in spectacle. He didn't believe in rebellion for its own sake. He believed in service, integrity, quiet strength. But when the institution he had served for decades refused to answer for what he had discovered, he realized that staying would mean accepting it. And he couldn't. His final act within the palace was to leave a sealed letter with his private secretary. It contained a copy of the full unredacted dossier, along with a statement of his concerns, and a formal notice relinquishing all active royal duties until a full investigation could be conducted. He didn't expect a response. He didn't need one. He had said everything that needed to be said. And when he walked out the doors of Buckingham Palace that final morning, he did so not as a disgraced prince, but as a man who chose the truth over tradition. When news of Prince Edward's quiet departure began to circulate among royal insiders, it wasn't immediately clear just how deep the fracture had become. At first, most assumed he had taken a temporary leave, perhaps for health reasons or to quietly support an under-the-radar family initiative. That's how the palace framed it. After all, the Earl of Wessex will be stepping back from public-facing royal duties for a brief period. The language was deliberately vague, safe, almost surgical. It was the same phrasing used for countless other royal adjustments. Nothing to see here. Just a pause. But behind the scenes, the mood was far less composed. Within 24 hours of Edward's exit, word reached senior royals that something more serious had occurred. He hadn't just stepped back. He had walked out with documents. With questions. With claims that shook the very foundation of the Crown's internal finances. And he hadn't done it quietly. Staff whispered about the confrontation with the Treasury Office, about the documents left behind, about the sealed letter addressed to the king that no one dared open outside of his private secretary. Inside the palace, this was not a pause. It was a rupture. The first to react was Prince William. He was reportedly briefed during a private meeting with his own aides at Kensington Palace. According to insiders, his initial response was frustration, not anger, but something colder, disappointment. William had always maintained a respectful relationship with his uncle, one built on shared duty and trust. Edward was the one who never complained, never leaked, never let personal frustrations become public affairs. And now? Now he had thrown a wrench into the institution's most delicate machinery. "He should have come to me," William is said to have remarked more than once. This wasn't the way. But that sentiment, while noble in tone, ignored the reality. Edward had tried the formal route. He had asked questions. He had presented findings. He had made his concerns known. And they were met with silence. Or worse, containment. Queen Camilla, meanwhile, was said to be furious. Not because of the financial allegations themselves. Camilla had little direct involvement in royal accounting, but because of the implications. To her, this wasn't about balance sheets. It was about loyalty, about the precedent being set. If Edward could walk out and call the monarchy's financial ethics into question, what was to stop others? Sources close to Camilla claimed she immediately urged Charles to issue a swift public statement condemning the leak, reasserting control, and signaling that the institution would not tolerate insubordination, even from within the bloodline. But Charles hesitated. The king was caught between two truths. On one hand, the monarchy thrives on unity, discretion, and hierarchy. On the other, Edward was his brother. And while their relationship had never been as strained as Charles's relationship with Andrew or Harry, it had always carried a quiet complexity. Edward was the quiet one, the reliable one. He had never stepped out of line before. So why now? That question haunted Charles. Not just as a monarch, but as a man. For several days, the king refused to speak about the situation publicly. Behind closed doors, however, he held private meetings with his top aides. His legal team reviewed Edward's documents. His private secretary vetted every claim. The senior treasurer returned to offer context and, in some cases, denial. What emerged from these sessions was a split in strategy. Some advisors urged Charles to stay silent and wait for the storm to pass. They argued that engaging with Edward's concerns, even to refute them, would legitimize them. That it would draw unnecessary attention to obscure financial mechanics the public neither understood nor cared about. Others argued that silence was dangerous, that Edward's silence had been a warning, not a retreat, that leaks were inevitable, that the longer they waited, the more ground they would lose in the public narrative. Ultimately, Charles made a decision that surprised many. He issued no formal rebuttal, but he instructed his press team to reframe the story. The palace began quietly briefing reporters that Edward's departure was deeply personal, related to private matters, and not indicative of any institutional breakdown. They emphasized his loyalty over the years. They called it a pause, a rest, a family matter, but not a crisis. It was a classic royal maneuver, pivoting from scandal to sentiment. And for a moment, it worked. The media, always eager for clarity, began shifting tone. Some outlets speculated about health, others about marriage or personal fatigue. A few floated the theory that Edward was stepping aside to focus on more charitable endeavors. But none of that was true. And inside the palace, everyone knew it. Princess and was reportedly one of the few royals who reached out to Edward directly. The two had long shared a pragmatic bond, both dutiful, both no-nonsense, both trusted to just get on with it. According to a source close to Anne, she left a voicemail on Edward's private phone the day after he walked out. It was brief, honest. "If you did this for the right reasons, I respect you. But we need to talk." Edward didn't return the call, not because he was angry, but because he had made a decision. He would not engage with the palace until they chose transparency over control. The reaction from Prince Andrew was, predictably, opportunistic. Though publicly silent, Andrew reportedly made comments in private circles about Edward's overreaction and misunderstanding of how things work. He allegedly laughed at the idea of Edward taking a moral stand over money. But those close to Edward say he never expected support from Andrew. In Edward's mind, Andrew was a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when power is abused and accountability is evaded. The real test came not from the family's words, but from their actions. One by one, Edward's scheduled appearances were quietly canceled. His name disappeared from future court circulars. Palace communications teams were instructed to redirect media inquiries about him to personal representatives, a euphemism for being unofficially disavowed. Within a week, it was clear Edward had not simply stepped back. He had been exiled, softly, silently, but unmistakably. Still, no one publicly denounced him, because denouncing him would mean acknowledging what he had uncovered. The family didn't know what to do with a prince who had chosen integrity over silence. They couldn't punish him like Harry. There was no public interview, no Netflix deal, no memoir. Edward hadn't spoken to Oprah or leaked private texts. He hadn't branded the family racist or archaic. He had, instead, done something far more subversive. He had acted from within. And that made him dangerous. Because if Edward, the loyal son, the steady brother, the quiet workhorse, if he had found something worth walking away over, what else was there? What else had been ignored? In the weeks that followed, tensions inside the palace reached a quiet boil. Meetings were tense, trust frayed. Longtime staffers began reconsidering their roles. Rumors spread of other royal aides keeping private records, of trustees wondering if they too had overlooked inconsistencies. The fallout had begun. But still, Edward remained silent. No statement. No interview. No second wave. Because he didn't need one. He had already said everything when he walked away. And inside Buckingham Palace, every marble hallway, every chandeliered meeting room, every perfectly rehearsed ceremony now carried the echo of a question none of them wanted to ask aloud. If Edward's right, what else don't we know? It happened on a Sunday morning, one of those quiet, gray London days when the city holds its breath between tradition and tomorrow. The newspapers were still unopened. The royal schedule was light. A few courtiers drifted through the halls of Buckingham Palace with coffee cups and clipboards, unaware that something irrevocable was about to unfold. Prince Edward did not call a press conference. He didn't draft a public statement or pose for photographs. He simply acted. A single letter, signed and sealed with his personal insignia, was delivered by hand to the king's private secretary. Its contents would never be released to the public in full, but three things were confirmed. Edward was formally relinquishing all official royal duties. He was removing himself from the working structure of the monarchy indefinitely, and he was doing so in protest of unresolved financial inconsistencies the palace had failed to address. It wasn't a suspension. It wasn't a retreat. It was a resignation. The wording was deliberate. Not an abdication, which implied failure or shame. Not an exile, which suggested punishment. But a principled break, unapologetic, direct, and final. His office at St. James's Palace was cleared within 24 hours. Staff were reassigned. His royal crest was removed from official stationery. His name was quietly taken off the upcoming events list for Remembrance Day, a tradition he had never missed. No explanation was given to the press beyond the recycled phrase, "The Earl of Wessex has stepped away from public duties." But within the institution, the shock ran deeper than words could show. For decades, Edward had been the steady hand, dependable, measured, immune to drama. When his siblings waged tabloid wars or endured public scrutiny, Edward remained untouched, a symbol of what the monarchy could still be when it chose discretion over spectacle. His resignation was not just unexpected, it was seismic. And unlike other royal scandals, this one didn't involve personal failings, family feuds, or external pressure. It came from within, and it hit the monarchy's most sensitive nerve, its money. In his private letter, Edward had included a final appeal, a plea for reform, not revolution. He urged the king to authorize a comprehensive, independent review of crown financial operations, specifically those connected to estate revenue and charitable funds. He outlined his findings, summarized the transactions in question, and warned that continued obfuscation would only erode public trust further. There was no threat, no ultimatum, just a truth laid bare. If the monarchy claimed to serve the people, it could no longer operate behind walls of silence. According to sources familiar with the matter, the king read the letter in silence, then folded it and placed it in a drawer. No formal response was ever sent. For Charles, the moment was devastating. Not because of public fallout, he had weathered that before, but because of what it meant in private. Edward had never betrayed the family. He had not attacked them. He had simply told the truth. And that was something the monarchy had never known how to handle well, not from within. The internal response was swift, but muted. Within days, the palace issued internal directives to staff. All questions regarding Edward were to be referred to external representatives. His name would not be used in press briefings. He would no longer represent the crown at official events. Charities under his patronage were advised to seek new royal sponsors. His royal wardrobe, military uniforms, medals, formal regalia, was placed into archival storage. It was as if he had been erased, not disgraced. Quietly airbrushed from the institution he had served for a lifetime. But Edward, for his part, had already moved on. He left London the same day he submitted his resignation. He didn't return to Bagshot Park, his royal residence. He traveled to a private estate in Gloucestershire, a property not owned by the crown, but held in a personal trust independent of royal financing. It was modest by royal standards. Secluded, discreet, with no press, no guards, no banners. Just countryside. Just space. In that first week of solitude, he declined all calls from the palace. He instructed his longtime assistant to take extended leave. He turned off his phone. He read. He walked. And he thought, not about what he had left, but about what he had uncovered. He had no plan to go public. Not yet. He didn't want to be the story. He wanted the truth to be the story. Still, the absence of official explanation only fed the media firestorm. Speculation exploded. Tabloids theorized everything from illness to secret feuds. Columnists debated whether Edward's departure marked the beginning of a broader royal reckoning. Royal commentators dissected his legacy, calling it the quietest act of rebellion in modern Windsor history. But to those who knew Edward best, it wasn't rebellion. It was responsibility. This was a man who had spent his life in service, never front-page news, but always present. He had given decades to the crown without asking for glory. And when he discovered that the institution he had supported was hiding behind a veil of complexity and privilege, he did what so few before him had dared to do. He said no. No to secrecy. No to complicity. No to silence. There was no joy in his departure. No celebration. Just a simple clarity that staying would make him a part of what he no longer believed in. Inside the palace, Charles was left to reckon with the fallout. His brother was gone. His message unanswered. And the institution he now led was under more scrutiny than ever. It was not the break that made headlines with fiery words or family betrayals. It didn't come with interviews, documentaries, or best-selling memoirs. It came with a letter, a step back, a door quietly closed behind him. And for the monarchy, that silence was louder than any scandal it had ever faced. The first headline appeared at 6:03 a.m. British time. It wasn't in a tabloid. It wasn't on a royal gossip blog. It was in a respected, data-driven investigative outlet known for exposing corporate corruption and international money laundering. The headline was simple but loaded with implications. Leaked royal documents reveal hidden financial network within the Crown estate. By 7 a.m., the story had spread to every major news platform in the UK. By 9 a.m., it was trending in the United States, Canada, Australia, and across social media. And by noon, the palace was facing one of the most serious public trust crises in its modern history. The documents in question, the same ones Edward had received weeks earlier, had been passed to a journalist named Rachel Thirlwell. She had spent her career uncovering hidden wealth systems used by multinational corporations and political elites. She had contacts across Europe, sources in the whistleblower community, and a track record for exposing precisely the kind of layered deception that made institutions squirm. She received the files through a secure Dropbox with no return information. But the contents were undeniable. Page after page of financial records. Ledgers showing money routed through offshore accounts. Entity names that repeated across transactions linked to Crown estate revenue. Contracts issued to shell companies registered in secrecy jurisdictions. Internal memos, dated and initialed, discussing strategic partnerships with holding firms that had no obvious operational functions but showed up in the cash flow charts. The leak was not just substantial, it was surgical. It didn't accuse anyone of theft. It didn't assert criminal intent. It simply laid out the structure, a hidden framework of financial transfers, reclassifications, and external consulting relationships that, over the years, had moved tens of millions of pounds beyond the reach of public accountability. The story hit hard because it didn't come with screaming accusations. It came with numbers, with names, with documents, and with one unmistakable theme: obfuscation. Within hours, the media began to swarm. Not just the gossip reporters who tracked royal romances, but the serious journalists. Those who understood balance sheets, trusts, and real estate portfolios. The leak revealed that between 2015 and 2023, at least 47 contracts were awarded by royal entities to private firms that had indirect ties to offshore financial havens. These firms operated as intermediaries, receiving income from Crown estate properties and redistributing funds through multiple layers of corporate entities. Some of those companies had the same directors. Some of them were formed within days of each other, and many shared the same London law firm for registration. The investigation linked these structures not to foreign actors, but to individuals associated with royal estate management and long-serving finance officers who had held advisory roles within the palace for decades. Rachel Thirlwell's team published a second installment that afternoon, a follow-up report that detailed one specific transaction involving a £2.3 million development consulting fee paid to a company that, on paper, had no staff, no operating website, and no digital footprint beyond a P.O. box in the British Virgin Islands. The company was dissolved less than a year after receiving the funds. The blowback was immediate and explosive. Parliamentarians from across the political spectrum began calling for a royal audit. Members of the public flooded online forums and comment sections demanding answers. Editorials ran with titles like The Gilded Black Hole, The Crown's Quiet Fortune, and When Secrecy Becomes Sovereign. Even longtime monarchists were disturbed. This wasn't about behavior or opinions. This was about money, publicly supported money, and the trust that came with it. For the palace, the leak was a worst-case scenario. They had gambled on silence, on managing Edward's exit quietly and hoping the documents would never surface. That gamble had failed, spectacularly. Inside the palace press office, emergency meetings were held before dawn. Communications advisors reviewed talking points, scrambled to draft contingency statements, and reached out to legal counsel. But they were at a loss. The documents were authentic. The financial pathways were real, and the news cycle had already outpaced them. The king, briefed shortly after 7 a.m., reportedly remained silent for several minutes. Then, in a tone that aides described as resigned but firm, he instructed the palace not to issue a denial. "There is no use denying what can be proven," he said. But he also rejected calls to issue a statement that admitted fault. Instead, the palace released a short press release by midday. "We are aware of the documents in question and are reviewing them in consultation with our financial and legal advisors. The Crown remains committed to the highest standards of integrity and transparency in all matters." It was classic royal understatement. But the public was in no mood for platitudes. Protests began outside the palace gates that very evening. Small at first, just a few dozen activists holding signs that read, "Show us the books," and "Where's our money?" But by the next day, the crowds grew. So did the media coverage. Journalists camped outside palace grounds. MPs gave interviews demanding investigation. Financial watchdog groups began publishing open letters calling for independent inquiries. And civil society organizations began pushing for reforms that had long been brushed aside as radical, ending the sovereign grant, requiring full audits of royal income, and publishing detailed Crown estate statements. Amid the uproar, one question began to dominate the conversation. Had Edward leaked the documents himself? Publicly, he said nothing. Privately, sources close to him denied that he had sent the files directly. But they did confirm that Edward had ensured the truth would find its way to the light. Interpret that however you like. Some called him a whistleblower. Others called him a traitor. But regardless of the labels, one fact was now undeniable. The monarchy's financial veil had been pierced, and it wasn't coming back down. The British public is no stranger to royal scandals. Over the decades, they've weathered divorce dramas, salacious memoirs, secret affairs, and family feuds that filled front pages and newsstands. But this was different. This wasn't about who said what at a wedding or who wore what at a funeral. This was about money, about power, and about the trust that binds a nation to its monarch. When the financial leak tied to the Crown exploded across media outlets, the outrage didn't bubble, it detonated. The early morning reports were greeted first with confusion, then disbelief, and by the time evening fell across the UK, a wave of indignation had swept from London to Liverpool, Edinburgh to Exeter. The first signs came online. On Twitter, hashtags like #CrownLeaks, #RoyalFundScandal, and #WhereIsTheAudit began trending globally. Instagram accounts that once fawned over royal fashion now reposted graphs of diverted funds. TikTok creators filmed explainer videos breaking down the shell company network in under a minute, translating dense financial reports into viral content. YouTube channels with millions of subscribers produced hour-long breakdowns titled The Hidden Fortune of the Monarchy and How Prince Edward Blew the Lid Off the Palace. But this wasn't just digital outrage. It spilled into the streets. In London, protesters gathered outside the gates of Buckingham Palace by the hundreds. Some held signs that read, "Edward was right, audit the Crown, and not my taxpayer money." Others carried placards with pie charts and spreadsheets printed from leaked reports. There were no chance of abolishing the monarchy, at least not yet, but the message was unmistakable. Accountability was no longer optional. Parliament took notice. Within 48 hours, cross-party calls for an inquiry echoed through the Commons. The leader of the opposition demanded a formal investigation into royal finances, stating, "The public deserves transparency from every institution, including the monarchy." A few bold MPs even proposed legislation requiring the Crown to submit to the same financial disclosure standards as public offices. At first, the Prime Minister's office tried to stay neutral, calling the matter an internal royal issue. But as pressure mounted, silence became untenable. Facing mounting questions from the press and growing unrest from constituents, the government announced that it would consider convening a parliamentary oversight committee to review and clarify the legal frameworks governing royal financial conduct. The monarchy had not faced this level of scrutiny since the days following Princess Diana's death. And through it all, the palace remained largely mute. The official response, a carefully worded four-sentence press release, had done little to quell the storm. If anything, it added fuel. Critics accused the palace of hiding behind language designed to deflect responsibility without addressing the substance of the allegations. Financial analysts took to the airwaves to dissect every line of the statement, noting its lack of specific denials or meaningful commitments. Former royal staffers began to appear on news panels and podcasts. Some spoke cautiously, referencing a long-standing culture of secrecy within the estate offices. Others were more candid. "There's always been this idea," one ex-advisor shared anonymously, "that royal finances are sacred territory. No one asks. No one tells. You follow the tradition and trust the accountants." But Edward broke that unspoken rule. He looked deeper, and that scared them. The more the public learned, the louder the outrage became. Articles began surfacing that outlined the true cost of the monarchy, both symbolic and material.